Hello, what's up, y'all? How are you doing? Today is October 6th. Good night, everybody. Good night, everybody. Tonight, I want to talk about low birth rate in Korea. Korea is famous for a lot of things such as Squid Game, BTS, and like Son Heung-min, the soccer player, and Squid Game, Kimchi, etc. Meanwhile, Korea has a lot of mm, other things, such as it has one of the highest suicide rates in the world, and among OECD, Korea is the only country whose fertility rates declined below one, which is not so good. And tonight, I want to talk about low birth rates. Uh, I know government is trying their best to increase birth rate, but even if they put an effort into it doesn't seem like it's going to get back up. And I think there are a lot of reasons behind this phenomenon, but like many factors that I can think of are like, sex preference, high education cost, and like extreme competition, female labor force, and increased divorce rate, stuff like that. But now I could talk about them, each of them in detail. But for for now, I just want to talk about it roughly. And to explain this, I have to talk about the time when economic crisis occur in Korea history. So it's gonna get really long and boring. So. mm, Yeah. Anyway, Korea, faces a lot of faces a decline in its future population, obviously, and even like around me, many Korean people are, like choose not to have children and still remain single. Mm. I'm 33 and I'm not married, and I don't know when I will marry, but I'm not married, I guess, because of few reasons, and society has affected me in some way. I mean, mm, so mm, pretty much about it. But out of all the things that I listed above, like sex preference and high education cost, um, extreme competition, I guess what I can think of is extreme competition. Hmm. That competition uh, is what drove Korea society, but then on the other hand, it was what made Korea people so sad. Hmm. And all that things mixed together, it was made into the drama called Squid Game, which is really popular these days. Just like I said it last time. I said it's sad but interesting. Hmm. In that perspective. Okay, enough of talking about low birth rate. I really talk about it for a short period of time, but then I'll try to talk about in detail next time. I just wanted to roughly I wanted to bring it up, but then okay, enough of talking, and I'll talk about not talk about. I'll read a book. Hmm. All right. Then preceded by the dog, who seemed to invite them by short bars to come with him, and followed by the reporter and the boy. He dashed out after having put up in his handkerchief the remains of the supper. The storm was then in all its violence, and perhaps at its height. Not a single ray of light from the moon pierced through the clouds. To follow a straight course was difficult. It was best to rely on Top's instinct. They did so. The reporter and Herbert walked behind the dog, and the sailor brought up the rear. It was impossible to exchange a word. The rain was not very heavy, but the wind was terrific. However, one circumstance favored the seaman and his two companions. The wind being southeast, consequently blew on their backs the clouds of sand, which otherwise would have been insupportable from being received behind, did not in consequence impede their progress. In short, they sometimes went faster than daylight and had some difficulty in keeping their feet, but hope gave them strength, for it was not at random that they made their way along the shore. They had no doubt that Nap had found his master, and that he had sent them the faithful dog. But was the engineer living, or had Nap only sent for his companions that they might render the last duties to the corpse of the unfortunate Harding? After having passed the precipice, Herbert, the reporter, and Pencroft prudently stepped aside to stop and take breath. The ton of the rocks sheltered them from the wind, and they could breathe after this walk or rather run of a quarter of an hour. They could now hear and reply to each other, and the lad having pronounced the name of Cyrus Harding, Top gave a few short barks, as much as to say that his master was saved. Saved, isn't he? Repeated Herbert. Saved, Top? And the dog barked in reply. They once more set out. The tide began to rise, and urged by the wind, it threatened to be unusually high. As it was a spring tide, great billows thundered against the reef with such violence that they probably passed entirely over the islet. Then, quite invisible, the mole no longer protected the coast, which was directly exposed to the attacks of the open sea. As soon as the sailor and his companions left the precipice, the wind struck them again with renewed fury. Though bent under the gale, they walked very quickly, following Top, who did not hesitate as to what direction to take. They ascended towards the north, having on their left an interminable extent of billows, which broke with a deafening noise, and on their right a dark country, the aspect of which it was impossible to guess. But they felt that it was comparatively flat, for the wind passed completely over them, without being driven back, as it was when it came in contact with the cliff. At 4 o'clock in the morning, they reckoned that they had cleared about 5 miles. The clouds were slightly raised, and the wind, though less damp, was very sharp and cold. Insufficiently protected by their clothing, Pencroft, Herbert, and Spilett suffered cruelly, but not a complaint escaped their lips. They were determined to follow Top, mm, wherever the intelligent animal wished to lead them. Towards 5 o'clock they began to break. At the zenith, where the fog was less thick, gray shades bordered the clouds under an opaque belt. A luminous line clearly traced the horizon. The crash of the billows were tipped with a wild light, and the foam regained its whiteness. At the same time, on the left, the hilly parts of the coast could be seen, though very indistinctly. At 6 o'clock they had broken. The clouds rapidly lifted. The seaman and his companions were then about 6 miles from the Chimneys. They were following a very flat shore, bounded by a reef of rocks, whose heads scarcely emerged from the sea, for they were in deep water. On the left, the country appeared to be one vast extent of sandy downs, bristling with thistles. There was no cliff, and the shore offered no resistance to the ocean but a chain of irregular hillocks. Here and there grew two or three trees, inclined towards the west, their branches projecting in that direction. Quite behind, in the southwest, extended the border of the forest. At this moment, Top became very excited. He ran forward, then returned, and seemed to entreat them to hasten their steps. The dog then left the beach, and guided by his wonderful instinct, without showing the least hesitation, went straight in among the downs. They followed them. The country appeared an absolute desert. Not a living creature was to be seen. The downs, the extent of which was large, were composed of hillocks and even of hills, very irregularly distributed. They resembled a Switzerland modeled in sand, and only an amazing instinct could have possibly recognized the way. 5 minutes after having left the beach, the reporter and his two companions arrived at a sort of excavation hollowed out at the back of a high mound. Their top stopped and gave a loud clear bark. Spilett, Hub, and Pencroft dashed into the cave. Nab was there, kneeling beside the body extended on a bed of grass. The body was that of the engineer, Cyrus Harding. Okay, now they found Cyrus Harding. Nab did not move. Pencroft only uttered one word. "Living?" he cried. Nab did not reply. Spilett and the sailor turned pale. Herbert clasped his hands and remained motionless. The poor negro, absorbed in his grief, evidently had neither seen his companions nor heard the sailor speak. The reporter knelt down beside the motionless body and placed his ear to the engineer's chest, having first torn open his clothes. A minute passed, during which he endeavored to catch the faintest throb of the hurt. Nab had raised himself a little and engaged without saying. Despair had completely changed his countenance. He could scarcely be recognized. Exhausted with fatigue, broken with grief, he believed his master was dead. Gideon Spilett at last rose after a long and attentive examination. "He'll leave," said he. Pencroft knelt in his turn beside the engineer. He also heard the throbbing, and even felt the slight breath on his cheek. Herbert, at a word from the reporter, ran out to look for water. He found 100 feet off a limpid stream, which seemed to have been greatly increased by the rains, and which filtered through the sand, but nothing in which to put the water, not even a shell among the downs. The lad was obliged to content himself with dipping his handkerchief in the stream, and with it hastened back to the grotto. Happily the wet handkerchief was enough for Gideon Spilett, who only wished to wet the engineer's lips. The cold water produced an almost immediate effect. His chest heaved, and he seemed to try to speak. "We will save him!" exclaimed the reporter. At these words hope revived in Nap's hut. He undressed his master to see if he was wounded, but not so much as a bruise was to be found, either on the head, body, or limbs, which was surprising, as he must have been dashed against the rocks. Even the hands were uninjured, and it was difficult to explain how the engineer showed no traces of the efforts which he must have made to get out of reach of the breakers. But the explanation would come later. When Cyrus was able to speak, he would say what had happened. For the present, the question was how to recall him to life, and it appeared likely that rubbing would bring this about. So they set to work with the sailor's jersey. The engineer, revived by this rude shampooing, moved his arms slightly and began to breathe more regularly. He was sinking from exhaustion, and certainly had not the reporter and his companions arrived, it would have been all over with Cyrus Harding. "You thought your master was dead, didn't you?" said the seaman to Nab. "Yes, quite dead," replied Nab. "And if Top had not found you and brought you here, I should have buried my master and then have lain down on his grave to die. It had indeed been a narrow escape for Cyrus Harding. Knapp then recounted what had happened. The day before, after having left the chimneys at daybreak, he had ascended the coast in a northerly direction and had reached that part of the shore which he had already visited. There, without any hope, he acknowledged, Knapp had searched the beach among the rocks on the sand for the smallest trace to guide him. He examined particularly that part of the beach which was not covered by the tide. For near the sea the water would have obliterated all marks. Knapp did not expect to find his master living. It was for a corpse that he searched, a corpse which he wished to bury with his own hands. He sought long in vain. This desert coast appeared never to have been visited by a human creature. The shells those which the sea had not reached, and which might be met with by millions above high water mark, were untouched. Not a shell was broken. Knapp then resolved to walk along the beach for some miles. It was possible that the waves had carried the body to quite a distant point. When a corpse floats a little distance from a low shore, it rarely happens that the tide does not throw it up. Sooner or later, this Knapp knew, and he wished to see his master again for the last time. I went along the coast for another 2 miles, carefully examining the beach, both at high and low water, and I had despaired of finding anything when yesterday above 5 in the evening I saw footprints on the sand. Footprints? Exclaimed Pencroft. Yes, replied Neb. Did these footprints begin at the water's edge? Asked the reporter. No, replied Neb. Only above high water mark, for the others must have been washed out by the tide. Go on, Nap, said Spilett. I went half crazy when I saw these footprints. They were very clear and went towards the downs. I followed them for a quarter of a mile, running, but taking care not to destroy them. 5 minutes after, as it was getting dark, I heard the bark of a which Top, and Top brought me here to my master. Nab ended his account by saying what had been his grief at finding the inanimate body in which he vainly sought for the least sign of life. Now that he had found him dead, he longed for him to be alive. All his efforts were useless. Nothing remained to be done but to render the last duties to the one whom he had loved so much. Nap then thought of his companions. They, no doubt, would wish to see the unfortunate man again. Top was there. Could he not rely on the sagacity of the faithful animal? Knapp several times pronounced the name of the reporter, the one among his companions whom Top knew best. Then he pointed to the south, and the dog bounded off in the direction indicated to him. We have heard how, guided by an instinct which might be looked upon almost as supernatural, Top had found him. Knapp's companions had listened with great attention to this account. It was unaccountable to them how Cyrus Harding, after the efforts which he must have made to escape from the waves by crossing the rocks, had not received even a scratch. And what could not be explained either was how the engineer had managed to get to this cave in the downs more than a mile from the shore. So Nab said to the reporter, it was not you who brought your master to this place. No, it was not I, replied the negro. It's very clear that the captain came here by himself, said Pencroft. It is clear in reality, observed Spilett, but it is not credible. The explanation of this fact could only be produced from the engineer's own lips, and they must wait for that till speech returned. Rubbing had reestablished the circulation of the blood. Cyrus Hardy moved his arm again, then his head, and a few incomprehensible words escaped him. Nab, who was bending over him, spoke, but the engineer did not appear to hear, and his eyes remained closed. Life was only exhibited in him by movements. His senses had not as yet been restored. Pencroft much regretted not having either fire or the means of procuring it, for he had unfortunately forgotten to bring the burnt linen, which would easily have ignited from the sparks produced by striking together two flints. As to the engineer's pockets, they were entirely empty, except that of his uh, waistcoat, which contained his watch. It was necessary to carry Harding to the Chimneys, and that as soon as possible. This was the opinion of all. Meanwhile, the care which was lavished on the engineer brought him back to consciousness sooner than they could have expected. The water with which they wetted his lips revived them gradually. Pencroft also thought of mixing with the water some moisture from the teacher's flask which he had brought. Herbert ran to the beach and returned with two large bivalve shells. The sailor concocted something which he introduced between the lips of the engineer, who, eagerly drinking it, opened his eyes. Nab and the reporter were leaning over him. My master!" cried Nab. The engineer heard him. He recognized Nab and Spilett, then his other two companions, and his hand slightly pressed theirs. A few words again escaped him, which showed what thoughts were even then troubling his brain. This time he was understood. Undoubtedly, they were the same words he had before attempted to utter. Island or continent, he murmured. Bother the continent, cried Pencroft hastily. There's time enough to see about that, Captain. We don't care for anything, provided you are living. The engineer nodded faintly and then appeared to sleep. They respected the sleep, and the reporter began immediately to make arrangements for transporting Harding to a more comfortable place. Neb, Herbert, and Pencroft left the cave and directed their steps towards a high mound crowned with a few distorted trees. On the way, the sailor could not help repeating, "Island or continent? To think of that, when at one's last gasp what a man!" Arrived at the summit of the mound, Pencroft and his two companions set to work, with no other tools than their hands, to despoil of its principal branches a rather sickly tree, a sort of a marine fir. With these branches they made a litter, on which, covered with grass and leaves, they could carry the engineer. This occupied them nearly 40 minutes, and it was 10 o'clock when they returned to Cyrus Harding, whom Spilett had not left. The engineer was just awaking from the sleep, or rather from the drowsiness in which they had found him. The color was returning to his cheeks, which till now had been as pale as death. He raised himself a little, looked around him, and appeared to ask where he was. "Can you listen to me without fatigue, Cyrus?" asked reporters. "Yes," replied the engineer. "It's my opinion," said the sailor, "that Captain Harding will be able to listen to you still better if he will have some more grouse jelly. For we have grouse, Captain," added he, presenting him with a little of this jelly, to which he this time added some of this flash. Cyrus Harding ate a little of the grouse, and the rest was divided among his companions, who found it but a meagre breakfast, for they were suffering extremely from hunger. "Well," said the sailor, "there is plenty of food at the Chimneys, for you must now, Captain, that down there in the south we have a house with rooms, beds, and fireplace. In the pantry several dozens of birds, which our Herbert calls crocus. Your little is ready, and as soon as you feel strong enough, we'll carry you home." "Thanks, my friend," replied the engineer. "Wait another hour or two, and then we'll set out. And now speak, Spilett. The reporter then told them all that had occurred. He recounted all the events with which Cyrus was unacquainted: the last fall of the balloon, the landing on this unknown land, which appeared a desert, the discovery of the chimneys, the search for him, not forgetting, of course, Nap's devotion, the intelligence exhibited by the faithful Top, as well as many other matters. But Ash Harding, in a still feeble voice, "You did not then pick me up on the beach?" "No," replied the reporter. "And did you not bring me to this cave?" "No." "At what distance is this cave from the sea?" "About a mile," replied Pencroft. "And if you are astonished, Captain, we're not less surprised ourselves at seeing you in this place." "Indeed," said the engineer, who was recovering gradually, hmm, and who took great interest in these details. "Indeed, it is very singular. But," resumed the sailor, "can you tell us what happened after you were carried off by the sea?" Cyrus Harding considered. He knew very little. The wave had torn him from the balloon net. He sank at first several fathoms. On returning to the surface in the half light, he felt a living creature struggling near him. It was Top, who had sprung to his help. He saw nothing of the balloon, which, lightened both of whose weight and that of the dog, had darted away like an arrow. There he was, in the midst of the angry sea, at a distance which could not be less than half a mile from the shore. He attempted to struggle against the billows by swimming vigorously. Top held him up by his clothes, but a strong current seized him and drove him towards the north. And after half an hour of exertion, he sank, dragging Top with him into the depth. From that moment to the moment in which he recovered to find himself in the arms of his friends, he remembered nothing. "However," remarked Pencroft, "you must have been thrown onto the beach, and you must have had the strength to walk here since Neb found your footmarks." "Yes, of course," replied the engineer, thoughtfully. "And you found no traces of human beings on this coast?" "Not a trace," replied the reporter. "Besides, if by chance you had met with some deliverer there, just in the nick of time, why should he have abandoned you after having saved you from the waves?" "You're right, my dear Spilett. Tell me, Neb," added the engineer, turning to his servant, "it was not you can't have had a moment of unconsciousness during which no, that's absurd. Do any of the footsteps still remain?" asked Harding. "Yes, master," replied Neb. "Here at the entrance at the back of the mound, in a place sheltered from the rain and wind. The storm has destroyed the others." "Pencroft," said Cyrus Harding, "will you take my shoe?" as the engineer requested, while he and Herbert, guided by Neb, went to the place where the footprints were to be found. Cyrus remarked to the reporter, "Hmm, it is a most extraordinary thing." "Perfectly inexplicable," replied the Gideon Spilett. "But do not dwell upon it just now, my dear Spilett. We'll talk about it by and by." A moment after the others entered. There was no doubt about it. The engineer's shoe fitted exactly to the footmarks. It was therefore Cyrus Harding who had left them on the sand. "Come," said he, "I must have experienced this unconsciousness, which I attributed to nap. I must have walked like a somnambulist without any knowledge of my steps, and Tom must have got me here after having dragged me from the waves. Come, Top, come on, old dog." The magnificent animal bounded, barking, to his master, and caresses were lavished on him. It was agreed that there was no other way of accounting for the rescue of Cyrus Harding, and that Top deserved all the honor of the affair. Towards 12 o'clock, Pencroft, having asked the engineer if they could now remove him, Harding, instead of replying, and by an effort which exhibited the most energetic will, got up, but he was obviously leaning on the sailor, or he would have fallen. "Well done," cried Pencroft. "Bring the captain's litter." The litter was brought. The transverse branches had been covered with leaves and long grass. Harding was laid on it, and Pencroft, having taken his place at one end and Nap at the other, they started towards the coast. There was a distance of 8 miles to be accomplished, but as they could not go fast and it would perhaps be necessary to stop frequently, they reckoned that it would take at least 6 hours to reach the chimneys. The wind was still strong, but fortunately it did not rain. Although lying down, the engineer, leaning on his elbow, observed the coast, particularly inland. He did not speak, but he gazed, and no doubt the appearance of the country with its inequalities of ground, its force, its various productions were impressed on his mind. However, after traveling for 2 hours, fatigue overcame him and he slept. Okay, I read it really, really, really hard tonight. Mm. I had this like mm, I had this how can I put it? Anyway, I'm tired and good night and see you tomorrow again.